The ghostly child. It was a house like any other, or at least it seemed that way at first. When we moved into the old Victorian home on the outskirts of Willow Creek, my family and I were thrilled. My parents, newly retired and eager for a change, had spent months looking for the perfect place. We needed space, quiet, and a home where we could start a new chapter of our lives. Little did we know, the house had already been home to something or someone else for much longer than we had anticipated. The house was beautiful, with tall, arched windows, intricate woodwork, and a large front porch that wrapped around to the side. It stood at the edge of a quiet, forgotten street, surrounded by towering oak trees that whispered with the wind. To the casual observer, it looked like something out of a storybook, charming, quaint, and perfect for a fresh start. But there was something about the air around it, a stillness that made it feel unnatural. We moved in during late spring. The air was crisp, and the scent of flowers carried from the garden as we unpacked boxes and made ourselves at home. At first, there were no signs of anything unusual. The creaking of the floorboards, the sound of wind through the trees, these were the normal sounds of an old house settling. But within a few weeks things started to change. It started small with little things. At night, my younger brother Danny would insist that he heard footsteps in the hallway running past his door. My parents, dismissing it as an overactive imagination, told him to go back to sleep. But one night after Danny came running into my room with tears in his eyes, I decided to check it out for myself. I sat up in bed, straining to hear, and sure enough, I heard something, a faint shuffling like someone walking softly across the wooden floors. I got up, heart racing, and checked the hallway. There was no one there. Must have been the house settling, I told him, trying to sound convincing. But something inside me wasn't so sure. The next few nights, things escalated. We all began to hear the sounds, the soft, echoing footsteps that would appear in the middle of the night, followed by what sounded like the rustling of sheets, as if someone were lying in bed beside us. But when we checked, the rooms were empty. The air in the house grew heavier with each passing day, and a sense of unease began to settle over us. One evening, as my parents were having a quiet dinner in the kitchen, I decided to take a walk through the house. I had been hearing strange noises again, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. As I made my way down the hallway, I stopped in front of the old nursery room, a room that had once belonged to a child, based on the faded wallpaper and the small vintage crib tucked into the corner. The door was slightly ajar, and the room felt unnaturally cold. I pushed the door open fully, half expecting to find nothing but dust and remnants of the past. But that's not what I found. There, standing in the corner, was a little boy. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, his hair disheveled, and his face pale as if he hadn't seen the light of day in years. His eyes were wide and dark, like pools of black water, and he stared at me with a strange, unblinking intensity. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached out toward me with a small, skeletal hand. My heart pounded in my chest and I stepped back, horrified, but before I could turn to run, the boy simply vanished. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone, like he had never been there at all. I ran to my parents, but when I told them what happened, they looked at me with concern, as if I had lost my mind. "You're just tired," my mother said gently. "It's a big house. You're probably just imagining things." But I knew what I had seen. And I wasn't alone. In the following days, Danny started acting strange. He would speak of a friend, a boy he called Charlie, who played with him in the backyard. "Charlie's my friend," he'd say with a big grin on his face. "He shows me things. He tells me stories." But there was no boy named Charlie in the neighborhood. And there was no child other than Danny living in the house. At first, my parents brushed it off as a product of his vivid imagination, But when Danny began drawing pictures of a little boy with pale skin and dark eyes, they started to worry. The drawings were disturbingly lifelike, and the boy in the pictures looked eerily familiar, like the same child I had seen in the nursery. Things only got worse from there. Danny's behavior grew more erratic. He would lock himself in his room for hours, speaking in hushed tones to Charlie, as if someone were standing right beside him. His health started to decline too. He grew pale, his appetite vanished, and he was plagued with nightmares. The once vibrant child who had loved playing outside and exploring the woods behind the house now spent most of his time huddled in the corner of his room, clutching his teddy bear for dear life. One night, when I went to check on him, I found him sitting on the edge of his bed, his eyes wide with terror. "Charlie's angry," he whispered, his voice shaking. "He says I'm not supposed to tell you. He says I have to go with him." Before I could ask him what he meant, the lights flickered and the temperature in the room dropped. I felt a cold chill wrap around me, as if the air had thickened with something sinister. And then, as I watched in horror, Danny's body seemed to twitch. His arms and legs jerked involuntarily, as if some invisible force was pulling him. His eyes rolled back into his head, and he let out a scream that still echoes in my mind to this day. I rushed to his side, but by the time I reached him, he collapsed into a heap, lifeless in my arms. I screamed for my parents, but when they arrived, Danny was already gone. His body was cold, his face drained of color, as if the life had been sucked out of him in an instant. The doctors couldn't explain it. They said it was some sort of rare medical condition that caused his heart to stop, but I knew better. I knew what had happened. The boy, Charlie, the ghostly child, had taken him. And he wasn't done with our family. From that night on, the house became unbearable. Strange occurrences were no longer just limited to the dead of night. The cold spots, the whispers, the sounds of tiny footsteps, these things followed us wherever we went in the house. My parents tried to ignore it, but I could see the fear in their eyes. It wasn't just the grief of losing Danny, it was something far darker. One evening I was sitting in the living room, my mind a whirl of thoughts, when I heard a faint giggle. It was high-pitched, childish, but filled with something malicious. I turned around, and standing in the doorway was the boy again. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition in them. "Where's Danny?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The boy smiled, a wide, crooked grin that chilled me to the bone. "He's with me now," he replied, his voice low and raspy like an old man's. "You'll see him soon. He's happy. He's playing. I made him stay." I backed away, panic rising in my chest. "What do you want from us?" I demanded, my voice shaking. But the boy only laughed, his voice rising in volume until it filled the room. It was no longer a child's giggle. It was something twisted, something inhuman. Before I could react, he vanished, fading into the shadows as if he had never been there at all. My parents were gone the next day. They packed up everything in a hurry, leaving the house as quickly as they could. I don't know if they ever believed me, but the fear in their eyes was unmistakable. I stayed behind for a few weeks, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. But it didn't take long before I realized that the house wasn't just haunted by the ghost of a child, it was cursed. The boy, Charlie, was never going to leave. And neither would I. As I walked through the empty house one last time, I could feel his presence again, like a weight pressing down on me. I could hear his laughter in the walls, in the floorboards, in the very air. I knew then that the house would never be rid of him. He would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next family to come along. Waiting to claim them. And as I left the house, I heard one last whisper, faint but unmistakable, "Help me." But no one could help us now.